At 3:17 in the morning, with rain ticking against the ambulance bay windows and the emergency department glowing with that cold, blue-white light hospitals seem to invent after midnight, Dr. Julian Mercer pointed toward the security desk and ordered Alina Marquez to surrender her badge. He did not lower his voice. He wanted the residents to hear it. He wanted the nurses at the station to hear it. He wanted the transport tech frozen beside the linen cart to hear it too. He announced that she was finished at Harbor Point Medical Center, accused her of overstepping and disrupting his trauma bay, and declared that she would not touch another patient in the hospital. Alina did not argue. Her face held the same calm expression she wore when she checked medication labels, when she changed dressings, and when people spoke over her as if silence were the same thing as weakness. She simply unclipped the badge from her scrub pocket and placed it on the counter. Then the monitor alarm from down the hall began to scream. It was not the short, irritated chirp of a loose lead or a polite warning sound staff members learned to ignore. It was the sharp, desperate sound that cut through walls, fatigue, coffee, and ego alike. Every head turned toward Trauma 2. The patient in that room was still alive because of Alina Marquez, and everyone there knew it. In that instant, everyone also understood that firing the quiet nurse did not make the truth disappear. Nothing in that hallway felt invented. The air smelled like antiseptic and wet pavement. A pair of gloves lay abandoned near the crash cart. A cup of vending machine coffee sat untouched beside the chart rack, its surface still trembling from the alarm. Mercer's jaw tightened, and he snapped at Alina not to move, as if she were the danger. She looked toward the sound anyway. In the bed beyond the swinging glass doors, the unidentified trauma patient she had fought to save was crashing again, and the physician who had just fired her was suddenly not moving very fast at all. 3 hours later, a Navy SEAL commander would walk into that same department, study Alina Marquez for one silent beat, and speak a single word that would make the entire hospital go still. The word was Sable. At Harbor Point Medical Center in San Diego, the emergency department had two kinds of people, the ones whose names were remembered and the ones whose work was. The remembered names were printed on plaques and donor walls. They were quoted in local magazine profiles about leadership and innovation. They wore tailored white coats, spoke in polished sentences, and knew exactly where to stand when cameras appeared. The work, meanwhile, was carried by everybody else. Alina had been at Harbor Point for 11 weeks. That was long enough for people to notice her, but not long enough for them to stop misjudging her. She worked the night shift because she had asked for it. She floated wherever coverage was thin. She took extra turns in overflow, step down, and the most chaotic side of the emergency unit without complaint. She never lingered at the desk to join gossip, never laughed too loudly, never volunteered stories about herself. When people asked where she had worked before, she answered only that she had worked in different places. It should have made her seem professional. At Harbor Point, it made her seem suspicious. Nurse manager Dana Reeves had called her the ghost on Alina's 4th shift, and not kindly. Dana had said it while smiling over a styrofoam cup of tea, with the easy casualness some people use to disguise cruelty. She had told Alina that she came in quiet, left quiet, and somehow nobody knew anything about her. She had advised her to be more visible because visibility, in Dana's mind, made people trustworthy. Alina had nodded and said she would keep that in mind, but being visible in that department mostly meant performing confidence for the people above you. Mercer admired people who narrated themselves. He liked residents who spoke in dramatic conclusions before lab results came back. He liked nurses who anticipated his moods. He liked gratitude aimed upward. Alina was not built that way. She checked every line twice. She restocked trauma carts exactly the same way every time. She labeled things with neat block letters that somehow made everyone else's handwriting look careless. She stood with loose shoulders and moving eyes, always noticing doors, corners, exits, equipment placement, loose tubing, missing clamps, and the subtle drift of a patient about to worsen before the monitor could announce it. Once, during a hectic shift, a resident dropped a syringe cap, and Alina caught it one-handed without even looking. The resident laughed nervously and called it weird. Another time, a helicopter passed low over the building, and Alina identified it as Coast Guard rather than Life Flight before the radio call confirmed it half a minute later. She never explained how she knew. Her screw B pockets were always organized the same way. Penlight on the left, trauma shears clipped inside, alcohol swabs stacked flat, never crumpled. Hooked beneath her ID on a key ring was a small silver compass worn smooth by years of handling. Nobody asked about it because nobody at Harbor Point asked quiet people meaningful questions unless the answer might be useful to them. Dr. Mercer noticed Alina only when she failed to flatter him. He was exactly the kind of physician hospitals like to promote because he sounded composed during interviews and looked expensive under fluorescent lights. Mid-40s, athletic posture, perfect hair that never seemed to move, and a smile that could turn warm or cold depending on who was useful. He ran the emergency department the way some men run a stage. Everyone else was scenery or supporting cast. He did not like being corrected, especially by nurses, and he absolutely did not like Alina Marquez, who had the unnerving habit of being correct without turning it into theater. Their friction began in small ways. On Alina's second week, Mercer had ordered the discharge of an elderly patient whose oxygen level kept dipping whenever he spoke. Alina had quietly asked whether he wanted to observe the man for another hour because the patient looked increasingly tired. Mercer had smiled in front of a resident and reminded her that he had completed medical school. The patient returned by ambulance before sunrise. Mercer never mentioned it again. Alina never mentioned it at all, and somehow that made it worse. By week 6, residents had begun calling her quiet nurse when they thought she was out of earshot. Sometimes they meant it as a joke, sometimes as an explanation. If Alina did not chatter, they assumed she was timid. If she did not advertise herself, they assumed there was nothing to advertise. They were wrong in the easy way groups often are, and that kind of wrong can survive for a very long time. On the night everything changed, the storm came in from the Pacific just after 11. The ambulance bay doors kept opening on gusts of wet wind. The waiting room filled with coughing, overhead pages, rolling wheels, half-finished apologies, and the low sound of a television mounted in the corner that nobody was really watching. Alina started the shift in fast track, got pulled to overflow, and then floated to the trauma side because 2 nurses had called out, and 1 resident had already asked for someone experienced without even looking at her, as if experience were an abstract resource instead of a person standing 3 feet away. At 12:41 a.m., while she was resetting a room after a chest pain workup, an ambulance called ahead with an unidentified adult male suffering severe blunt force trauma, unstable vitals, and possible thoracic injury. He had no wallet and no family at the scene. The paramedic's voice crackled over the speaker and reported that the patient had been found near Harbor Drive after a collision. He had been conscious initially and was now drifting. His blood pressure was unstable and his oxygen saturation unreliable. They were 3 minutes out. Mercer stepped from his office like a man responding to a spotlight and ordered the patient into Trauma 2. He instructed the staff to notify surgery, prepare blood, and move quickly. Alina was already moving. She laid out airway equipment, checked suction, adjusted monitor leads so they would not snag during transfer, hung fluids while leaving room for rapid changes, and pulled warm blankets from the cabinet. Her motions were fast, efficient, and so practiced they almost looked effortless. Dr. Priya Kwan, a smart second-year resident with enough sense to notice competence wherever it lived, glanced at Alina and remarked that she had clearly done this many times before. Alina answered only that she had done it enough. When the stretcher came through the doors, the department changed. The patient was in his late 30s or early 40s, broad-shouldered even under soaked civilian clothes. His face was pale beneath a shadow of stubble. Bruising crossed his upper chest where the restraint had caught him, and his breathing had that shallow, guarded pattern that made trained people stop pretending things were fine. There was no spectacular blood, no cinematic horror, only the much more dangerous signs of damage the eye could not fully see. The paramedics began their report. They described a single-vehicle collision, possibly forced off the road. They noted airbag deployment. The patient had self-extricated and then collapsed. He had become hypotensive en route, and breath sounds were diminished on the right. Mercer cut in before they finished and asked whether there was any indication of intoxication. The paramedic, caught off guard, answered that there was none. Mercer pointed out that the man had been found alone at 1 in the morning with no identification, as if that meant more than the clinical signs in front of High. Alina was looking at the patient's hands while the report continued. The knuckles were scarred. The nails were clean. On the inside of one wrist was the pale outline of a watch band that had been worn for years and removed recently. There was a thin friction burn high on the palm and an older healed line along the forearm that did not look accidental. None of it proved anything on its own, but Alina noticed the pieces. His boots were expensive but heavily used, with salt dried into the edges. Mercer palpated the chest quickly, listened once, and ordered portable X-ray labs and transport to CT as soon as radiology cleared the scanner. He said they needed images. The patient stirred and winced without waking fully. Alina was checking the neck veins when she saw it. The rising pressure, the lag in the right side, the faint change in skin tone that was not yet blue or gray but already emptying of reserve. She quietly told Mercer that she did not think the patient would make it to CT. Mercer did not even turn. He answered that it was a good thing he was the one making that call. Priya looked from Mercer to Alina and asked what she was seeing. Alina said only that the patient was compensating hard and the pressure was building. Mercer dismissed the assessment as diagnosis by instinct rather than evidence. The patient opened his eyes briefly. Not fully, just enough to show he was trying to orient himself in a room that was too bright and too loud. Alina leaned closer and told him he was at Harbor Point and needed to stay still. His gaze found her face for half a second. He seemed to focus, not on her name badge, but on her eyes. Then he looked at her hand near the rail, where the silver compass on her key ring flashed once under the trauma light. A small crease crossed his brow and vanished again. Mercer called for transport. Priya, still uneasy, asked Alina what exactly she was seeing. Alina replied that she was looking at someone about to lose the argument with time. The transport team released the bed brakes and the patient's monitor changed. It was not a full collapse yet, only a stumble. His heart rate climbed. His blood pressure slid. His oxygen refused to cooperate. Alina ordered the bed stopped. Mercer ordered it moved. Alina repeated the command, and this time her voice changed. It was still not loud, but it carried in the way quiet voices sometimes do when they have spent years being obeyed in worse places than hospitals. The transport tech froze on instinct. Mercer stepped toward her in anger and repeated his order. The patient inhaled sharply and then seemed unable to finish the breath. Alina reached for the ultrasound and directed Priya to look at his chest. Mercer objected that they were wasting time. Alina answered that they had already run out of it. Priya placed the probe where Alina indicated and watched her own face drain of color. There was no lung slide. Mercer moved in, saw it, and for one brief second his expression showed the thing powerful people fear most, the realization that someone beneath them understood the danger first. The patient crashed before anyone could pretend otherwise. Alarms erupted. The rhythm on the monitor twisted. The room exploded into motion. Alina planted herself at the bedside, and the softness disappeared from her posture like a coat dropping to the floor. She called for the code, for massive transfusion, for surgery, and for decompression first. Priya obeyed before Mercer did. The next 30 seconds belonged to skill rather than hierarchy. Alina organized the room before the overhead page had finished. She directed compressions, airway positioning, blood setup, access checks, and the clearing of space around the bed with clipped precision. Not frantic, never frantic, focused. Mercer tried to reclaim control by saying he had it. Alina handed him what he needed before he asked. The emergency intervention was performed, air released under pressure. The monitor climbed back into a rhythm that was weak, dangerous, but alive. Breath sounds improved enough to buy minutes. In trauma, minutes are entire countries. Priya stared at Alina and asked how she had known. Alina looked at the patient, then at the blood hanging wide open, and said only that the patient had told them. No one laughed at her after that. A trauma surgeon rushed in, took in the situation, heard the rapid update, and asked who had called the problem before imaging. Priya answered before Mercer could. She identified Alina. The surgeon looked at Alina once with sudden focus and then back to the patient. He called it a good catch. 2 ordinary words, but in that room they landed like a crack in the foundation. The patient went upstairs alive. Not safe, not stable, but alive. The surgeon's preliminary impression reached the department by phone from the operating room and was blunt enough to destroy any effort to minimize what had happened. Another few minutes and the patient would have been L. OST, trauma rooms empty differently after a save. The noise does not stop at once. Gloves still snap. Wrappers still crinkle, machines still hum as if they do not know a human life just slid past them on a knife edge. But the emotional temperature changes. People look at one another differently. Priya removed her gown and looked at Alina as if she had just discovered a locked door standing open. She remarked that Alina must have worked trauma somewhere bigger than Harbor Point. Alina answered only that she had worked somewhere different and reminded Priya to clean the ultrasound probe before anything dried on it. Priya laughed once in disbelief and said Alina could at least pretend to be impressed with herself. Alina folded the used towel and answered that the patient was upstairs alive, and that was enough. Across the room, Mercer was typing his note with the clipped movements of a man pressing too hard on his keyboard. Dana Reeves entered wearing polished concern and asked what had happened because she had heard there was confusion around transport. Nobody answered quickly. That alone told her enough. Mercer turned only after he had arranged his expression and stated that there had been unauthorized interference with physician-directed care, but that he had handled it. Alina looked at him then, not defiant and not afraid, just level. Dana asked whether it was true. Priya opened her mouth, but Mercer cut across her and announced that he did not need residents reconstructing his trauma bay. He reduced the near-fatal crisis to a patient destabilizing during workup and a team correcting the issue. He made it sound collective. Alina had been in enough institutions to know what came next. Not gratitude, reflection, or humility, but reputation defense. She checked the cart, replaced what had been used, and did not help Mercer lie for himself. To a man like Mercer, that refusal was its own kind of aggression. For 20 minutes, the department moved under the strange current of people pretending a line had not just been crossed. 2 nurses whispered while charting. A radiology tech came down looking pale and repeated that the OR attending wanted to know who had made the call. Priya replayed the sequence in her head and became more certain with each pass that Alina had saved the patient and that saying so aloud might cost her something. Mercer watched all of it and then made his move. At 2:08 a.m., he called Alina into the glass-walled consultation room beside the nurse's station. He did not close the blinds. That was deliberate. Dana stood by the counter with a tablet in her hand and a neutral face arranged into place. Mercer leaned against the desk in the manner of television doctors about to deliver hard truths. Alina entered, closed the door behind her, and remained standing. Mercer accused her of directly challenging his orders during an active trauma case. Alina answered that she had warned him the patient was unstable. Mercer said she was not credentialed to override a physician. Alina replied that she had not overridden him. She had stopped a dying man from being wheeled farther from the people who could help him. Dana's eyes flicked up and then back down. Mercer smiled without warmth and identified her real problem as tone, boundaries, and an inflated sense of role. Alina said nothing. He continued because silence always sounds like weakness to people who have never used it well. He claimed she had embarrassed a department chief in front of staff and then created chaos in his trauma bay with improvised command language that confused the team. Alina answered that nobody had looked confused. Dana finally spoke and said that whether or not Alina's instincts had proved useful, there were structures at Harbor Point and staff did not freelance. Useful, as if what Alina had done were some clever trick rather than the reason there was still a heartbeat upstairs. Mercer pushed a printed form toward her and announced immediate administrative suspension pending termination review. Dana added, in the softened procedural tone managers use when they want cruelty to sound like policy, that because Alina was still within her probationary period, the hospital could elect to separate employment immediately. Mercer made it clear that the hospital would. Alina looked at the paper. The first line accused her of insubordination during active trauma management. The second accused her of compromising physician authority and the care pathway. She set the paper down and said there should also be a note that she had warned against CT transport before the patient crashed. Mercer answered that she did not dictate his documentation. Alina replied that she was asking whether he intended to tell the truth. Dana inhaled. Mercer straightened and demanded her badge and locker key. No investigation, no interview, no waiting for surgical findings. No effort to hear from the resident who had watched everything happen, just removal. Alina handed over the locker key. Her ID badge followed a second later, laid carefully on the desk face-up. Dana reached for it almost too quickly, as if the symbol mattered more than the facts. Mercer stepped aside and opened the door, indicating that security could walk Alina out. Alina answered that security knew the hall. For the first time that night, Priya broke rank. She came to the doorway and told Mercer that what he was saying was not what had happened. Mercer turned slowly. Priya's voice wavered once and then steadied as she explained that Alina had called the problem before the crash. Dana cut in to remind Priya that it was not her meeting. Priya replied that she had been there. Mercer moved toward her just enough to intimidate in real life while staying non-threatening on paper. He told her to learn from the incident and insisted that emotion was not evidence. Alina stopped in the hallway and turned back not to defend herself, but to spare Priya from standing alone. She told Priya to finish her shift. Mercer laughed shortly at the exchange. Alina looked at him and told him that if the OR asked for a sequence, he should give them the right one. She still did not plead. Security arrived because hospitals run on timing more than justice. An older guard named Lewis approached with visible discomfort. He knew Alina by name because she brought him coffee on cold nights when the lobby doors stuck. He apologized softly. Alina told him it was all right. They walked toward the staff lockers beneath humming corridor lights. Alina passed rooms she had worked in, patients she had reassured, and supply alcoves she had reorganized because nobody else cared enough to fix them. A unit clerk looked up, saw the escort, and looked away fast. Humiliation is loud even when nobody speaks. At her locker, Alina took very little. Her jacket, a paperback marked by a receipt, a protein bar, and the olive green duffel some staff had jokingly called military surplus without realizing how close they were to the truth. Hanging on the inside hook was a dark woven lanyard in a knot pattern too precise to be decorative. Lewis noticed it and asked whether she needed a box. She said she was fine. As she zipped the duffel, the overhead speakers paged the trauma surgeon upstairs. Then an OR runner passed Dana in the hall and reported that the chest pressure had been exactly what they suspected, and that if the patient had gone later, he would have died. Dana's face changed for only a second. Alina heard it and kept zipping the bag. By then, truth was already moving faster than the paperwork intended to bury it. By 3:02 a.m., Alina was sitting alone in the staff exit corridor with her duffel at her feet and rainwater shining on the parking lot beyond the glass. She had not cried in the consultation room. She had not cried in the hallway. She had not cried at the locker. Now, with the automatic doors opening and closing for distant arrivals, she wrapped both hands around a paper cup of coffee Lewis had insisted she take and stared at the reflection of the emergency sign in the wet pavement. There is a kind of anger that does not burn hot. It settles. It becomes weight. Not because the person feels nothing, but because she has felt too much before and learned the cost of letting it show in front of people who would use it. Alina knew what Harbor Point did not. Humiliation loses power when it is not new. She had seen louder men than Mercer, colder institutions, higher stakes, harder exits. Still, this one landed. She had not come to Harbor Point to prove anything. She had come because the night shifts fit around her mother's physical therapy schedule, because civilian work was supposed to be simpler, and because she was tired of rooms where every second might become the second someone did not come home. She had chosen ordinary on purpose. Harbor Point had mistaken that for smallness. Her phone buzzed once on the bench beside her. A message from an unknown internal extension said that the OR had confirmed she was right and apologized. It was Priya. A minute later, another message followed, saying Priya should have spoken sooner. Alina replied with only 3 words telling Priya to finish her shift. Then she leaned back, closed her eyes briefly, and listened. Some people hear rain, some hear engines. Alina heard patterns. Vehicle doors, footsteps, the change in the automatic door cycle when a gurney passed instead of a person. The rhythm of stress inside a building that had not yet realized it was about to be inspected by truth itself. A little after 4, another message arrived from an unfamiliar number. It reported that the patient was asking for the nurse with the compass. Alina stared at the words and did not answer. Upstairs in surgical recovery, the unidentified patient surfaced in fragments. The operation had relieved the immediate danger. Internal bleeding had been managed. The pressure threatening his lungs and heart was under counter. All for the moment. He was alive in the fragile, monitored, hard-won way that makes an entire team briefly reverent before the next emergency arrives. When he could focus enough to speak, he did not ask first for pain medication. He asked where she was. The recovery nurse leaned closer and asked who he meant. He answered that he meant the nurse, the one with the compass. He drifted out again before they could get a name, but not before he used one more word so softly the nurse almost thought she imagined it. The word was Sable. It was entered into the chart as an uncertain patient utterance. At 4:39 a.m., a hospital administrator on call received a request from Military Liaison Services for an immediate update on an unidentified trauma admission matching a missing service member tied to a training adjunct program near Coronado. At 4:52 a.m., Harbor Point's Chief Operating Officer, Malcolm Wade, was awakened. At 5:11 a.m., Dr. Mercer was asked to remain on site until further notice. He did not like that. He liked it even less when Dana's second attempt to frame the incident as a routine disagreement was met with a simple instruction from administration not to edit anything and to preserve all logs. Mercer stood very still after reading the message and then opened the chart. Timestamps suddenly mattered to him very much. He revised language, softened edges, shifted sequence, turned Alina's warning into generalized team concern, transformed his transport order into collaborative decision-making, and recast her intervention as confusion under pressure. It was almost elegant, and it might have worked if Truth had not already been traveling by other routes. The charge nurse had heard the OR comment. Priya had texted a colleague in ICU about what happened. The transport tech had told radiology the patient had nearly died in the hall because someone refused to listen. Lewis had told the day security lead in a careful, low voice that the wrong person had been walked out. Hospitals are like ships in that way. Official channels matter, but crew memory matters too. By dawn, Harbor Point's crew was no longer telling one story. Daybreak in a hospital is rarely beautiful. It is fluorescent and tired. It tastes like reheated coffee and disinfectant. It arrives on the faces of people who stayed too long and in the voices of people trying to sound fresh when they are not. At 6:07 a.m., a black government sedan rolled beneath the emergency canopy. No lights, no spectacle, only quiet authority. A tall man stepped out first in a dark raincoat over civilian clothes. His hair was close-cropped and silvering at the temples. He was straight-backed, without stiffness, the kind of composed presence that makes people move aside before they know why. Beside him came a woman in Navy uniform with lieutenant commander insignia and a medical liaison badge clipped neatly against her chest. The receptionist looked up, began the standard greeting, and stopped in the middle of it. The man introduced himself as Commander Nathan Cole and said he was there about the unidentified trauma patient admitted overnight. The receptionist called administration. Mercer saw Cole from the far end of the station and felt the floor tilt in a way nobody else could see. Cole did not behave like a man in a hurry, which made him more dangerous. He accepted no chair, took no coffee, and offered no hand first. He simply looked at the department and seemed to take in the whole room at once, the faces avoiding his, the charts still open, and the tension vibrating beneath everything. Malcolm Wade arrived from administration with Dana at his shoulder. Mercer joined them half a beat later, his expression arranged into professional sympathy. Wade began a smooth summary about the patient's stability and the team's fast response, but Cole interrupted with a single question. He wanted to know who had stopped transport. The question landed in the middle of Wade's sentence like a dropped blade. Mercer recovered first and called it a complex series of clinical decisions. Cole looked directly at him and repeated the question. Mercer introduced himself as the emergency department chief, noted that he had been overseeing the case, and explained that the patient deteriorated during movement to imaging and that the team had responded appropriately. Cole asked again who had stopped transport. Priya, charting nearby and listening with a racing pulse, spoke before fear could overtake her. She said that Nurse Marquez had stopped it. The silence that followed was different from the others. Cole turned slightly and repeated Alina's last name as if recognition were traveling toward him from a distance. Wade seized on procedure and explained that she was not currently on duty. Cole asked why. No one answered quickly enough. Dana stepped in and said there had been an employment matter arising from Alina's conduct during the incident. Cole's gaze moved to her and settled there. He observed, not as a question but as fact, that the nurse who had kept the patient alive had somehow ended up with an employment matter. The lieutenant commander beside him opened a folder. Cole asked not for a summary but for the sequence. Mercer gave it as smoothly as he could. Arrival, assessment, planned imaging, sudden decompensation, team response, stabilization, transfer. Cole listened without interruption, which somehow made Mercer sound less credible. Then Cole asked a strange, specific question. He wanted to know what had been in the patient's right hand on arrival. Mercer blinked and failed to answer. Cole explained that it was a detail from the scene and implied that if Mercer had truly managed the case, he would remember it. Mercer admitted he did not recall. Priya did. The patient had arrived with a broken length of dark cord wound twice through his fingers, as if he had held it on instinct even while semi-conscious. Cole nodded once, almost to himself. He knew more than he was saying. They moved to the consultation room for a formal review, but the department listened anyway because that is how hospitals work. Walls exist and ears adapt. Wade pulled up event logs. Dana brought incident forms. Mercer presented his note. The military liaison reviewed the patient's operative timeline with a face that gave away nothing. Cole stood by the glass watching the emergency floor through the reflection and did not sit even when offered a chair. He asked where Nurse Marquez was. Wade exchanged a glance with Dana and admitted that she had been sent home pending further action. Cole told them to bring her back. Dana stiffened and said she was not sure that would be appropriate until human resources had been involved. Cole turned just enough to look at her and explained that the man upstairs had asked for Alina by description before full consciousness returned, that he had used a word recognized by his office, and that Cole intended to speak with Alina before anyone else decided what was appropriate. The liaison added with soft precision that this should happen before any further changes appeared in the documentation. Mercer's pen stopped moving. That was the moment the room's temperature dropped. Wade agreed to request Alina's return. Mercer made one last attempt to frame the entire situation as misunderstanding. He warned Cole against overreading a stressful event and described Alina as a competent bedside nurse, but nothing more. Cole answered that he had spent most of his life learning the cost of underreading stressful events. Then he asked for the security footage from the trauma corridor. Dana objected that the hospital did not typically release that material. Cole looked at Wade, and Wade agreed too quickly that a review could be arranged. At the station, Lewis lifted his eyes and met Priya's gaze. He gave the smallest nod. For the first time since Alina surrendered her badge, Priya felt hope move through the department like current. Alina was still in the staff exit corridor when Wade's call came through. She nearly let it ring out. The sky outside had shifted from black to steel gray. Her coffee was cold. She had spent the last hour thinking less about being fired than about whether she should have pushed harder earlier, whether the patient's second crash had cost him damage that quicker action might have prevented, and whether she was more tired than she admitted. When the phone rang again, she answered. Wade introduced himself and asked whether she would return to the department for a follow-up discussion regarding the overnight incident. She said that helpful was an interesting word to use after what had happened and asked only whether the patient was alive. When Wade confirmed that he was, that was enough. She agreed to come back. She walked through the rain toward the main entrance and caught her reflection in the glass. Wet hair pulled back, scrubs creased from a shift that had become something else, a face more tired than angry. She looked like exactly what Harbor Point thought she was, an exhausted nurse returning for paperwork. Nobody watching her cross that lot would have guessed that she had once stood in louder storms than this one, with helicopters thundering overhead and men bleeding out under a sky that did not care. Nobody at Harbor Point knew why she always sat facing the door. Nobody knew why dropped metal made her flinch when shouting did not. Nobody knew why she still carried that old compass. They were about to learn just enough to feel ashamed. By the time Alina stepped back into the emergency department, the whole floor could feel the strain beneath the surface. Conversations softened when she passed. Some people looked relieved. Others looked nervous. A few looked guilty. Mercer did not come out to meet her. Wade did. He approached with the polite urgency of a man trying to outrun consequences in dress shoes and thanked her for coming back. Alina set the duffel near the wall and Dee said nothing. Wade said he would like to ask a few clarifying questions in the consultation room. Alina asked whether she was still terminated. Wade blinked and said her status was under review. Alina answered that this had not been her question. Before he could say more, the consultation room door opened and Commander Nathan Cole stepped out. He saw Alina. She saw him. Recognition arrived through layers like light finding old glass. Cole's posture shifted first, only slightly, but enough for people watching to feel it. His eyes dropped once to the silver compass at her keys, then rose to her face and held there. Alina's expression tightened around the eyes, not with surprise exactly, but with memory hitting hard. Cole crossed the distance between them without haste. Wade began to introduce Alina, but Cole stopped in front of her, lowered his voice, and said the word Sable. The department fell silent. Even the monitor sound seemed far away. Alina drew one slow breath and answered with his first name, Nathan, not Commander Cole. Mercer had come to the doorway by then, and the care with which he controlled his expression became its own confession. Cole said he had thought it might be her. Alina answered that she had been hoping it would not matter. Cole explained that Micah had asked for the nurse with the compass and then used her call sign, which narrowed the field considerably. Dana, unable to stop herself, asked what he meant by call sign. Cole turned and answered simply that yes, it was a call sign. With that, the department's old assumptions began to collapse. Nobody moved. Wade recovered first and suggested they continue inside. Cole nodded but kept his eyes on Alina and asked whether she would join them. She looked like she wanted very much to say no. Then she thought of the man upstairs who had come in nameless and left the emergency room alive. She said she would answer questions and nothing more. Inside the room, the glass walls suddenly felt too transparent for the people who had liked them that way earlier. Wade closed the door. Dana sat with her tablet but no longer seemed in control of it. Mercer remained standing, perhaps because sitting would have felt like yielding ground. Priya stayed outside the glass where no one had invited her, and no one quite dared send her away. Cole did not begin with Alina's past. He began with the patient. He identified the man as Chief Petty Officer Micah Reed, attached to Naval Special Warfare Training Support. Reed had been returning from an overnight movement when he was forced off Harbor Drive. The circumstances were still being clarified. He had arrived unidentified. He was alive because transport had been halted before imaging and pressure had been relieved in time. No one interrupted. Cole continued that before surgery and again in recovery, Reed had identified the nurse who intervened by description and by a call sign used in prior service. Dana looked from Cole to Alina as if the room had shifted under her chair. Wade asked carefully what capacity of prior service he meant. Cole let the silence breathe and then answered. Former Senior Chief Hospital Corpsman Alina Marquez had served for years in high-acuity trauma and tactical casualty support. After active deployments, she had trained advanced hemorrhage control, airway management, and evacuation protocols for teams operating in environments where delay kills. Her call sign had been Sable. The word hung in the room. Mercer's eyes flicked toward Alina and then away. Priya, outside the glass, whispered to herself in disbelief. Cole was not finished. He said Alina had forgotten more about recognizing physiological collapse under pressure than most institutions ever learn. Then he turned to Mercer and asked again with complete clarity who had stopped transport. Mercer swallowed and admitted that Alina had. Cole asked whether she had done so against his direction. After a longer pause, Mercer admitted that she had. Cole looked at Wade and observed that the hospital had fired the correct person for saving the wrong man from the wrong doctor. Alina interrupted him. She did not want the patient turned into a prop inside a story about an arrogant physician. She wanted the truth stated plainly. A patient had been unstable. She had said so. She had been ignored. He had crashed. They had recovered him. Then she had been removed. Cole held her gaze for a second and nodded. Wade had gone pale in that administrative way people do when institutional language starts failing them. Dana tried to retreat into procedure and said the hospital had been acting on the information available at the time. Alina looked at her and answered that Dana had possessed the same time everyone else had. What followed was not loud. It was worse for the people who hoped noise might blur responsibility. It was orderly. Security footage was pulled. Event logs were displayed. Medication timing, transport requests, door access, radiology. Call stamps or notes and monitor archives were laid side by side like pieces of a machine taken apart until the fault became obvious. The corridor footage had no audio, but it did not need any. It showed transport beginning. It showed Alina stepping toward the bed and raising a hand. It showed Mercer gesturing sharply. It showed the transport team stopping anyway. It showed the patient buckle. It showed the room erupt into emergency response before the bed had moved 6 feet. There was no version of the footage in which Alina caused the problem. There was only the version in which she saw it first. Priya was brought in to give her statement. She shook at the start and steadied by the end. She explained that the patient's neck veins had worsened, his chest movement had become more uneven, and Alina had warned Mercer before transport. She described how Alina told them to stop, how she herself confirmed the absent lung slide after Alina directed the ultrasound probe, and how she believed the patient would have arrested farther from the trauma bay if transport had continued. Wade asked whether Mercer had acknowledged Alina's warning. Priya looked at Mercer once and answered that he had dismissed it. The transport tech confirmed the stop. The OR attending, joining by phone, confirmed that the urgency had been exactly as Alina predicted. Lewis from security confirmed that Alina had been escorted out before any meaningful review had taken place. Dana's tablet had become a witness against her. Mercer attempted to frame the event as a fast-moving judgment call under stress, a regrettable conflict, a breakdown in communication. Then Cole asked whether Mercer had altered his note after being informed that military liaison was involved. Wade froze. Dana looked sick. Mercer said he had only clarified language. Cole replied that the clarification had come after initial submission. When Mercer failed to answer, the liaison slid 2 versions of the note forward. The room went still. Mercer's second mistake after underestimating Alina was underestimating procedure. People who rise quickly inside institutions often believe procedure exists for them to manage. They forget that on the rare morning procedure turns and looks back, it can be merciless. Wade requested that human resources join remotely. Risk management was added. The hospital's legal counsel dialed in. The room filled with people who cared much less about Mercer's pride than about liability, retaliation, chart integrity, and the fact that a wrongfully terminated nurse with extraordinary credentials now sat 3 feet from a military commander who had every reason to remember details. Dana made one final attempt to retreat. She said that regardless of Alina's background, the concern remained role boundaries. Cole looked at her with what was almost disbelief and said that Alina's background was role boundaries. She had recognized the boundary between confidence and catastrophe, and the department had crossed it. Before the room could turn, Alina's passed into a shield for everyone else's failure. Alina spoke again. She said her background did not excuse anyone in that room from listening to bedside concerns voiced by people without call signs. She did not need to be who she had once been for what happened that night to matter. That was the line that hit Priya hardest. Alina had not needed her military past to be right. She had only needed them to stop assuming that quiet meant less. That was why the truth shook Harbor Point so thoroughly. Not because Alina turned out to be extraordinary, but because she had already been treated as disposable before anyone knew it. Cole looked at her then with a different kind of respect, older and quieter, the kind earned long before Harbor Point ever existed in her life. At last, Wade did what institutions do when facts are no longer negotiable. He shifted. He announced that effective immediately, the termination action against Alina Marquez was rescinded pending full review, that her record would reflect no misconduct related to the incident, that Dr. Mercer was being placed on administrative leave while charting integrity and clinical decision-making were investigated, and that Dana Reeves would step out of supervisory authority over the matter until Human Resources completed review. Dana tried to protest. Wade cut her off with a tired final refusal. Mercer's composure cracked, not dramatically but visibly. He tried to call the entire process absurd and began blaming a panicked resident and a grandstanding nurse for what had happened. That was when Priya, still outside the glass, pushed the door open and stepped inside. She was done being careful. She told Mercer that what was absurd was that Alina had saved the patient. Mercer knew she had saved the patient, and yet he had tried to erase her for being right in front of him. The room did not collapse into shouting. It did not need to. The facts were already stacked too high. Wade instructed Mercer to stop speaking until counsel was present. Dana lowered her eyes. Cole said nothing because by then silence was doing more damage than words. Alina sat very still through all of it. There was no triumph in her face, no satisfaction, only fatigue and a kind of distant grief that comes when vindication arrives after something unnecessary has already broken. The review ended with process still unfolding around her. Apologies began, first formal, then clumsy, then genuine in the few people who deserved the word. Wade offered Alina immediate paid leave and asked that the hospital be given the chance to make things right. Alina answered that institutions always say that after the truth becomes expensive. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize what had happened. She simply stood, took hold of her duffel, and asked one question. She wanted to know whether Micah Reed was expected to live. Cole answered that he was. That answer mattered more to her than anything Wade or Dana could say. Before she left the consultation room, Priya stopped her. There were tears in Priya's eyes now, not theatrical and not strategic, just honest. She told Alina she had been right about everything, including the part about speaking up sooner. Alina studied her for a moment and then told her to remember the patient, not the politics. The lesson was simple. See what is in front of you, say it clearly, hold the line when it matters. Priya nodded like someone being handed not comfort, but responsibility. Cole walked Alina partway down the corridor. He did not crowd her with questions about where she had been or why she had vanished into a civilian emergency department. He knew enough not to do that in public. He asked instead whether she wanted to see Micah before she left. Alina was quiet for a moment. The rain had started again, soft against the windows. The department behind them had resumed its motion, but nothing in it was the same anymore. She said that if Micah was awake enough to know who she was, she would see him for a minute. No more. Upstairs, the machines sounded gentler than they had in the trauma bay. Micah Reed looked pale and stitched together by exhaustion, medication, and survival, but his eyes were open when Alina entered. Recognition landed slowly and then all at once. He looked at the compass on her keys, then at her face, and some old field instinct seemed to settle in him. He did not smile much because smiling hurt, but the look in his eyes was enough. He had made it. She had been there, that was all. Alina stood near the bed and told him he had given everyone a difficult night. Micah answered that he had always hated making things easy for institutions. Even weak and medicated, the dry humor was there. He thanked her, though the word seemed too small for what he meant. She told him to save his strength and let the surgeons keep earning their salaries. He watched her for a long moment and then said that he had recognized the compass before he recognized her face. She touched the smooth metal with her thumb. and answered that some habits outlive the reasons for them. When she turned to leave, Micah asked whether Harbor Point had finally figured out who they had tried to fire. Elena paused at the door and said that it should not matter who she had been. It should have been enough that she was the nurse standing there. Micah, even half-broken and patched together, understood exactly what she meant. He closed his eyes for a moment and nodded. By late morning, the story had already changed shape throughout the hospital. Some people repeated the military details with awe as if that were the real revelation. Others, the better ones, repeated the simpler truth. A nurse had recognized a life-threatening change. A doctor had ignored her. A patient had nearly died. Then she had saved him anyway and been punished for it. Those were the facts that mattered. The rest only explained why some people felt so embarrassed for having looked at Elena and seen so little. Harbor Point would spend days writing reports, preserving footage, notifying committees, involving counsel, and inventing official language for failures every person in that corridor had already understood without help. Mercer would discover that polished confidence does not survive timestamps forever. Dana would learn that procedural cruelty becomes hard to disguise once documentation starts answering back. Wade would issue statements about patient safety, respectful culture, and institutional accountability. Some of it would even be true by the time they finished. But the real correction had happened earlier, in a rain-lit corridor under blue-white hospital light, when a quiet nurse put up one hand and refused to let a dying man be wheeled farther from the people who could save him. Everything after that was simply the building catching up. Elena left Harbor Point that afternoon with her badge restored and her record cleared. Neither of those things felt like victory. Victory would have been a room that listened the first time. Victory would have been a system in which a bedside warning mattered whether it came from a decorated veteran or a brand new hire. Still, as she stepped out beneath the gray San Diego sky, there was something steadier than triumph in her. The truth had survived contact with power. Sometimes that is the closest thing to justice people get. The rain had eased to a fine mist. Her duffel hung from one shoulder. The compass rested against her keys, smooth and familiar in her hand. Behind her, Harbor Point continued on, fluorescent and busy and newly aware that the people it overlooks are often the ones holding the line. Ahead of her, the parking lot shone with pale morning light. She walked toward it without hurry, the same way she had moved through the trauma bay, through the accusation, through the humiliation, and through the truth when it finally arrived. Quietly, steadily, impossible to ignore once seen clearly.